Welcome to the Happy Rebel podcast, where we explore the sacred in between, the liminal spaces where healing, growth, and transformation take root. I'm your host, Kelly Street, therapist, coach, and the heart behind Happy Rebel, where we blend self-development practices with the tools to support your journey. It's my mission to help others embrace both the light and the dark within us. Here, we dive deep into living authentically, navigating transitions, and finding meaning in the shadows. You'll hear soulful conversations and practical wisdom shared by guests, along with my own teachings and reflections. So whether you're seeking guidance through a tough transition, looking to ignite your creativity, or craving a deeper connection with yourself, you're in the right place. This is the Happy Rebel podcast. I'm so glad you're here. As we enter the space of the Happy Rebel podcast, I invite you to gently focus your eyes, or if possible, allow your eyes to be fully closed. Take a deep, cleansing breath and exhale to ground into your body. Inhale deeply, visualizing a golden light in your heart center. With each exhale, imagine that light growing stronger and brighter. Continue breathing as you prepare to honor the complexities of life, embracing the balance between the light and the dark of your own experiences and the conversation to come. With another deep breath in and out, holding gratitude for this moment of grounding and connection, slowly open your eyes or come back to the space as we begin this podcast adventure together. Hello, Lanice, I'm so excited to have you here. I cannot wait to get into our topic and to talk about all the things, period.
So thanks for having me on the show. I'm really excited for our conversation.
Yes. So why don't you tell our listeners just a little bit more about yourself and your history?
Yeah, so I am a Canadian in London. So I've lived here for over 20 years. So that's why while you're listening, you might think, oh, what kind of accent does she have? There's a lot of English that's crept into my accent. But I am a nutritionist specializing in women's health, hormones, and the menstrual cycle. And I'm also the author of the book, You Can Have a Better Period. I am a yoga teacher and meditation teacher as well. So I really enjoyed opening up my conversation with like a short meditation practice that was really nice for settling my nervous system.
Awesome. Yeah. I like to think of having these conversations and doing this podcast as like a little bit of a sacred space. And the way to set the tone for that, of course, is to drop in. So I'm glad that you appreciate it. And I know that about your background too. And I thought, oh, hopefully I always get a little bit intimidated when I'm meeting with someone who has a meditation or yoga background as well. I'm like, are they going to think it's okay, like that I'm doing this right? But that voice subsides and we just drop into the space.
Exactly. I think that what you did with the visualization around the heart center was really, really lovely. So it was perfect.
Thank you. So there's one other crossover that we have in our background that you do not know, but I learned in reading your book, actually, is that you and I have both had career changes, like pretty major career changes. So I went from marketing into becoming a therapist and yoga, and Reiki, and, all of those sort of healing modalities. And you also made a shift. So I'd love to know a little bit more about that to start off with.
Yeah. So I worked in advertising for over 15 years. So I went to university, got my bachelor's in political science and history, and then I did a bit of traveling and ended up in London, and I did a master's degree in marketing. And then I ended up working in marketing and then advertising for over 15 years. And I loved it until I didn't. It was a lot of traveling. By the end, I was traveling back and forth between London and Paris a lot. And yes, it sounds glamorous, but when you're actually in it, you miss your bed, you miss having a routine. And yes, it was fun going to Paris all the time. And yeah, my client was Chanel, which is it sounds very glamorous, but when you're actually in it, it was just, I was on the road to burnout. And I actually got pregnant, and that was the beginning of a kind of reckoning for me. It was planned. So my husband and I had been talking about having a child, and I got pregnant, and I said to myself, what do I want to do? Do I want to come back from my maternity leave because I was planning to take a full year. I know this is very privileged to be able to do that, but we had planned it financially so that I could do that. And we have very generous maternity leave in the UK. So I was very lucky and privileged to be able to do that. But I started thinking ahead. I'm a planner and I just like to know what's to come. And I just thought to myself, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to do something else. And I started casting about for different ideas. I actually considered retraining as a therapist because I've always found that side very interesting, understanding people's behavior, but also helping them find a path through whatever is they were going through. But then I landed on nutrition. And so while I was retraining, I worked part-time in advertising. And that was really interesting because it gave me a different perspective to be able to kind of have a foot in both worlds and actually see how like how what I was doing was actually the right thing. So going from a place where I was trying to convince people to buy things that they
Yes.
didn't necessarily need. I mean, like a Chanel at that point, Chanel bag was like £4,000, like,
Yes.
and to then going to a place where I was helping people with health issues. And so did my training. As soon as I graduated, I resigned from my freelancing, whatever I was doing, and I set up my business. And I just said, if I don't dive 2 feet in, I'm not going to do this properly. And again, very privileged to be able to do that, to have planned financially, use a lot of savings to be able to just dive straight in. But I also felt like I have to be brave about this. It's a big move, but if I don't do it fully, I'm gonna dither. And so I just went straight in, and like the first year and a half was really tough. Setting up a new business, new processes, but also letting people know this is what you do. And it hasn't all been smooth sailing, but I don't regret changing career at all. I feel like I'm doing what I'm meant to be doing.
Yeah. And I think I would absolutely agree just from seeing a bit of you on social media, reading your book, and just knowing that your message is such an essential message for the world and for 50% of the world. I think to really understand what a menstrual cycle is supposed to look like, to be healthy, to nourish and nurture yourself. So I'm glad that you're doing what you're doing.
Thank you.
So let's get into that. I know there are a lot of, I am learning that there are some different ways that we get conditioned to think about menstruation or periods. And I know that I have a lot of that, grew up with a lot of that cultural conditioning. And I think the first one that I would love to go into is periods. They should be painful, right? I say with sarcasm.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's such a great way to start this conversation because there's a lot of, I think, cultural, social, religious preconceptions that are built into having a period. What we learn from those around us, maybe the religion that we practice, but also kind of on a societal level, the messages around menstruation. And we learn, and I think that's starting to change, but we learn that periods are supposed to be painful, maybe because you have your mum or you have a family member who has had really painful periods and you've just seen them just kind of grin and bear it, and like you just see, because that was my experience. My mum, her periods were incredibly painful, incredibly heavy, and so well I just thought that's just that's the way it's supposed to be. But the reality is that periods are not supposed to be excruciating. There can be a light twinge, there can be aches, you naturally or more tired or have lower energy levels during menstruation, but they're not supposed to be so painful that you're relying on painkillers, that you are bedbound, you can't do what you need to do. That's a sign that something's going on. And the analogy that I always use is I compare it to having a toothache. So if you have a really, like, something's going on with one of your teeth, you wouldn't just leave it and you wouldn't say, well, this is just the way it's supposed to be, right? My teeth are supposed to be painful. No, you would go to the dentist, call like or get an emergency appointment and try to get it sorted out. And that's the attitude that we need to have around menstruation. Understanding what's normal and what isn't, and be able to push through all of this conditioning that, this is supposed to be a painful period, to be able to say, well, actually, maybe my period is really painful because I have endometriosis, or maybe I have fibroids, or maybe I have adenomyosis. There's something going on, and I need to start to figure out what that is.
Yes, absolutely. And I think about I've done some acupuncture and like more Eastern medicine practices, and it's been really reassuring to work with those practitioners. And they have the same message of, it really shouldn't be painful. There are, like you said, light twinges or some like cramps. Like that's a normal thing. Our uterus needs to contract to expel the fluids, but it shouldn't be so painful that you're bedbound or like doubled over in pain or throwing up. I have had friends who would be sick for days during their cycle. And I remember seeing that all the way back in high school, where one of my friends, I walked into the bathroom one day and she was just curled up on the floor, doubled over in pain, had a migraine. And at the time I was like, oh, she just has bad periods. This is just her experience. And now I'm like, wow, I wonder what was actually going on.
Yeah, and unfortunately, what you're describing is incredibly common. It's starting in school, you see girls just having these different varying degrees of difficulties, and having to go to the nurse or having to call one of their parents to be picked up, and or just missing school because their period experience of the period is either very, very painful or it's very heavy. And then that kind of goes into another issue around like really heavy periods, which also aren't something that we should be accepting. Having a period where you leak all the time, where you're having to change your menstrual products more often than every 2 hours. It's, it again, we learn, oh, it's heavy, it's fine, that's just something I have to deal with. But that's a sign again that something could be going on that needs to be addressed.
Yes. And I think of this is a little bit different, but so my listeners know and people in my life know that I have I've had a long infertility journey, and that I can just remember all the times, not even about period, but that I went to the doctor saying, I'm having a lot of pain at so and so time. I'm just having a lot of pain and I don't know what's going on. And it was always dismissed, always like, oh, pain with sex is sometimes normal, or it's, well, how bad is it really? And just always kind of being dismissed or told that you're probably fine, it's probably normal. And it turns out that there were things like endometriosis going on and some other stuff that just never got addressed because societally pain.
Well, firstly, I'm really sorry that you had that experience. I think, it's totally unacceptable that you went to your doctor for help and you were dismissed. I think, that's just, it's almost like malpractice, where you found in the end that you had endometriosis. And what I always say about painful periods, which are suspected endometriosis, is that you need to get this looked into as early as possible, because with endometriosis, the lesions, they can spread, and you need to have that, like, you need to know what's going on so you can start to take practices that can manage what's going on. But that's the kind of dismissing and diminishing women when they have health issues. I just think it's so frustrating, because often you hear, okay, well, just make sure you have a female doctor. But, it's women who do this to each other as well. It's almost like, well, my period was like that, so that's just the way it's supposed to be. And what I think really is really interesting is that the American College of Obstetricians and gynecologists, they've actually stated that periods and menstrual cycles and ovulation are a vital sign. So
Mm.
it's alongside blood pressure, heart rate, breath rate, and temperature. as signs that tell you that there's something going on. So you go to the doctor, they always check your temperature, they'll always want to check your blood pressure, they'll ask you about your period. Sometimes it's not appropriate. Like you go to the doctor and you're like, I think I've broken my arm. You don't need to know when my last period was.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're good.
Yeah, but this idea that our period of and ovulation are a vital sign, I think that's really important because it's a stake in the ground to say that when this vital sign shifts or there are issues, it's important enough that it needs to be looked into further.
Absolutely. Yes. It's just so good. I I want to speak to quickly the religious conditioning that you mentioned, because I'm not sure that this would necessarily be front of mind for everyone, but if you were like me, raised in a Christian household and took the Bible fairly seriously in my household of origin, I was so delighted to read in your book that you quote a verse from Genesis about women experiencing pain. Like, I think it's mostly related to childbirth, but still that it just really normalized from the first book of the Bible, like, normalizes that women are bad and should experience pain. And so it's a punishment. And I grew up with that conditioning. And so I think that was also playing out in my mind. And now that I've maybe shifted my belief system, shifted how I treat and integrate with my body, like, I have such a different view on that, but I just have to call out, I was so glad that you used that in your book.
Yeah, I think that it's really interesting because like there's a lot of things from the Old Testament that, when, you look at the New Testament and like what Jesus said, there's like that just cast all of those things away. But people, they hold a lot of that quite dear, like attitudes around women in pain, homosexuality, all of that. However, I think what's really interesting is you look at other religions. So in the book, I talk about Orthodox Judaism and this the purity bath, the mikveh, and how some women have started to turn it on its head and use that as an opportunity to hold space for themselves. Because the idea is that women need to, according to that part of the belief system, is that women are impure during their period and they need to go have this ritualized bath and to be cleansed. And then women have now taken it as like, actually, forget all of that, this is a space that I'm going to have for myself. So you want me to go to the bath? Great, I will go and I will enjoy it and it will be a moment for myself. Then you have other religions, like I think it's in Sikhism. I think I do talk about this a little bit in my book, where it's actually, they've rejected all of this idea of like women being impure and unclean during their periods, and actually said this is quite a powerful time and women need to be protected. Um, and I think that's quite exciting because if you think about physiologically what's happening in our bodies, where we're over the course of the menstrual cycle, that from the first day of your period all the way through to the day before your next period starts, that's anywhere between 21 to 35 days. You're creating this lining, you're shedding and then creating this lining. Like, that's pretty amazing that our bodies are able to do that. And then in between, we're also releasing the biggest cell in our bodies. The ovum, the egg that we release during ovulation, is the biggest cell in our body. That's amazing that our bodies are doing that every single, what I call the menstrual month. And I think, women should be more respected for, just because our bodies are just doing so much more. Isn't it? There should be respect, not fear.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Oh, I love so much of what you say. Speaking of the honoring and honoring of that cycle, one of the things that I love that you pull in, and I know this was not your original idea, but is the idea of equating our parts of our cycle with the seasons. I think that's so lovely. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so this is originated by the two women, Shawnee and Alexandra, who formed the Red School, and they equated the four phases of the menstrual cycle to seasons. And I think this is really interesting because it takes it away from being quite scientific, quite medicalized, to a place where everyone understands the four seasons. You might have a different experience of the kind of out, like the external seasons, depending on where you live. But the idea is that during winter is menstruation. So if you live in the northern hemisphere, winter is a time of shedding. It's a time of hibernation. The ground is very fallow. It's a time where your intuition is stronger. So you can tune in, you can make better decisions. Then you move to the next phase, you finish your period and you're coming into spring. So this is the follicular phase. And what we have is estrogen is rising, testosterone is rising. You're starting to step into your power a little bit more. You see kind of externally, we're in spring now. We've just had the spring equinox, so we're actually in spring. You see this kind of blooming. The flowers are blossoming, the trees, there's more green, there's more light, and we can feel that in our bodies. And then we move into what I actually think is the focal point of our menstrual cycle. It's not menstruation, it's actually ovulation. Then this is our internal summer, inner summer. And this is where we release an egg from one of our two ovaries. Our estrogen has just peaked, our testosterone has just peaked. This is where we feel most like ourselves. We feel very confident, very powerful. Our communication has peaked. I'm actually ovulating right now, so this is a perfect time for this conversation.
Amazing. And I'm so glad that you share that. That's perfect.
And then we have the next phase, so our inner autumn. And what I like to do is I like to separate this into two parts because most people they call this PMS. And I think that does us a bit of a disservice because after you finish ovulation, progesterone has started to rise. And progesterone is a very calming hormone. So you might notice that your sleep improves, your mood is a lot calmer. And so in this early luteal phase or early fall is akin to fall, kind of how we experience it externally. So you kind of think of like September, maybe early October, where it's still bright. There's still a kind of crisp energy in the air. Then late fall, so late autumn, late luteal phase. This is where estrogen, progesterone, they start to decline. And this is akin to late October, November, where the nights they're starting to draw in. You're kind of starting to prepare for the hibernation of winter. So a lot of us associate this with PMS, but it's really like you might actually notice that towards the end of your menstrual cycle, you have more energy and it's very focused. It's like you have a to-do list that you're trying to get through. And there's a reason for that because your body is trying to prepare you to slow down during your period. So those are the four seasons and the kind of comparison to the external season. And I think it's really helpful to just see what your individual experience is of those seasons. Everyone's different. What I'm sharing is a kind of like, it's not the standard, but it's something like you kind of it's like a bar to set like okay, what's going on and what is actually my experience of the four phases. So if you notice during ovulation that your energy is really low or you get migraines or your your mood is really low, that's a sign that something's going on. So, like someone with premenstrual dysphoric disorder, PMDD, they will notice that ovulation is actually not a great time for them. And so, if you're listening and you're thinking ovulation is not great for me, that's something to look into. Same with right before your period, where people talk about PMS. Rather than just saying, okay, the week before my period is not going to be great, try to dive a little bit deeper and think, okay, well, actually, what's actually going on here? Rather than just labeling it PMS, say, like, okay, actually, what's going on is I have premenstrual anxiety. I get cravings, a lot of like really distinct cravings, or I get really tired. And then you can address each of those issues rather than it just doing this broad brush of I'm PMSing. because I think that does you a disservice, but also it doesn't enable you to get the help and support you need.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so breaking it down into it's not just that I'm crabby. It's okay, what type of cranky is this? Am I having anxiety? Am I feeling low and sad and depressed? Is my body really tired? Okay.
Yeah, and I dive into all of this in my book. So if you have my book, you can have a better period. You can like read all about this and then be able to kind of troubleshoot what's going on for you specifically.
So, one of the things, and I maybe just haven't gotten this far in your book because I'm only about a quarter of the way in, or maybe not even quite that far, but I'm starting it, I'm reading it, and is thinking about the seasons of the menstrual cycle, but also since you have your nutrition background, how we eat. Because I've had someone, I went on this women's retreat almost 2 years ago now, and one of the women on that retreat does these meal packages where she does meal planning and meal prep and for women specifically, and it's based on their menstrual cycle. And so she specifically has a meal plan that's, 6 days, 7 days, 8 days, 4 days based on their cycles themselves. And so I'm curious if what your thoughts are on varying what you eat depending on where you are in your cycle.
That's a great question. Okay, so I think it's quite neat to be able to say, like, neat and tidy to say during your period you should eat this. During ovulation you should eat this. And when you look at my book, you will see that I have chapters on each of the phases, and I talk about specific food during each of the phases. But what's really important is that all of those foods are helpful all throughout your menstrual cycle. So being from day one of your period all the way through to the day before your next period, the menstrual cycle. And you don't have to just eat high iron foods during your period. You don't have to just eat oily fish for omega-3 fatty acids during ovulation. It will help all throughout your menstrual cycle. So there's this kind of naturopathic remedy practice called seed cycling. And the idea with seed cycling is that you split your menstrual cycle into two parts. So from day one of your period until ovulation, you would eat 2 tablespoons each of pumpkin seeds and flax seeds. And then from ovulation to the day before your next period starts, you would eat 2 tablespoons each day of sesame seeds and sunflower seeds. And the idea is that flax seeds are really helpful for increasing and managing estrogen, for American listeners.
Thank you.
Pumpkin seeds are a really great source of zinc, which is important for making testosterone, which rises in women after they finish their period. And then sunflower seeds are a really great source of selenium, which is helpful for ovulation. And then sesame seeds, great source of magnesium, which is super helpful right before your period because it's a really great source of magnesium, which is very calming and helps with premenstrual anxiety and premenstrual pain. But the thing is that you don't want to just limit those nutrients to those phases. They're helpful all throughout your menstrual cycle. It's very neat and tidy to be able to say, during this time, eat this. During that time, eat this. But the body doesn't necessarily work like that. You eat all of those foods throughout your menstrual cycle, but you might want to eat more iron. If you have a really heavy period, you want to eat a little bit more iron foods during your period and afterwards to help with the blood flow, but also blood rebuilding and iron levels. You might want to eat more magnesium food right before your period to help with premenstrual anxiety, or maybe you get bloated, premenstrual bloating. I know a lot of people experience that. Eat more potassium foods right before your period, like things like potatoes are a great source of potassium. So it's very neat and tidy to say eat this at this time, but the body doesn't really work like that. And I know
Yeah.
I might be bursting people's bubbles a little bit here. But I just, yeah, it's just important to be honest and be aware of like what the body actually does.
No, I think that's good to note. And because I know that, yeah, there are a lot of people who could kind of fall into the, oh, well, I have to eat this on this day. And frankly, I think that not having that perspective leads to a little bit more openness and less pressure, which is always nice because we have so much pressure on ourselves already
Yeah.
that if I think I have to eat this on these days, otherwise, my body's going to go haywire, it won't work, whatever, then that's not great.
No, it's another way of like this pressure, and it's almost like another level of kind of restriction that we have on ourselves because I often think like, women, we have so much space in our head around food. And if we just stop thinking about food so much and our bodies so much, imagine what we could do with that mental space.
Yeah. Do you have any tips for how to quiet that food noise and that body noise a little bit? Is that something that you work with clients on?
Yeah, so the principle that I really operate around is one of addition rather than restriction. So you're thinking about what you're adding into your meals rather than what you're taking away. And I think it's really interesting because we hear so much about low carb, no sugar, no this, no that. But what if we're saying like each plate that you put together, you're thinking about what you're adding. So, am I eating enough protein? Is my plate really brightly colored? Have I got enough fat on the plate? Have I got enough fiber? So you're just putting, it's almost like a checklist in your mind of addition. And I think it's really empowering because it moves us away from this place of having to say no, no, no all the time to a place of yes, yes, I can have this, I can have that. And I just find it just incredibly empowering.
Yes, that is such a nicer perspective and I think I already got that understanding from just how far I've gotten in your books at this point is you talk about, I'm not going to say you can't eat any sugar. Or I'm not going to say that you can't have this or can't do that because every single person is different and what works for me might not work for you, but also less rules. Isn't that great?
Yeah, yeah. We have so many rules and rules about how we're supposed to behave and be polite and this and that. Like it's very tiring.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so I think the last thing I would love to get into for this conversation is I was so delighted that when I checked out your podcast, I listened and heard that the first thing you do is you ask people about their first period stories. And I will say, like, as a mental health practitioner, like that was so exciting to me because I will often ask people what their first memories are in life in general, or like if we're working on relationship issues, like what are your first memories of love, feeling loved, giving love, receive, all of that. And so when I heard that that's what you ask people, I was like, that must give you so much information when you work with someone to hear about their story of their first period.
Yeah, it does. And it gives me, there's a lot of clues, not only in the story that they tell you, but the way that they tell it, the kind of language that they use. So it's immediately like you can get a lot of information if someone is quite using very negative, very shaming language, but also their experience around it. So I've spoken to some women and they say like, actually, I don't remember. And it
Wow.
might be that they just, it just got kind of caught up and like it just didn't stick in their mind. But for others, it might be that they just didn't want to remember it because they went on to have very painful, very traumatic experiences around menstruation and then the wider menstrual cycle. But yeah, definitely the way that they talk about that experience, it gives clues. But it's also just really interesting to then the kind of follow up question I ask is like, how did you learn about menstruation? Did you get taught in school or just tell me a little bit more about that? And again, There's also an age difference where a lot of the older women that I speak to, and when I say older, it's typically, like 40s, 50s, 60s. It is, oh, I would read about it in magazines, or we would have the nurse come in. And it's the younger women, which I find really interesting. I would search what I wanted online, and or I would search on like social media and get information there, which is like throws up loads of other issues, about legitimacy and credibility around sources. But yeah, it's just hearing, it's almost freeing in a way to be able to be asked this question that often women don't think about. They've had their period and they've had it for a long time, and they don't tend to go back to their first period. So it can be kind of like a happy kind of fact finding journey of like going back into the past and like, oh, actually, what was that experience actually like?
Yes. Yeah, that's really cool. Okay, I already have like 4 more questions that are coming to mind, but I'm going to honor our time today and just say, where can people find more about you and read your book and all those things?
Yeah, so on socials, my handle is at Eat Love Move, and my website is eatlovemove.com. My book, You Can Have a Better Period, is available anywhere you buy books online. And you can check out my podcast that you kindly mentioned, Period Story. It's anywhere you listen to podcasts, and season 10 is going to be coming out in the next couple of months. So that's exciting.
Yes, very exciting. Yeah, even if you are not someone who currently is experiencing a period, I still think that if you are a woman, female, that it's helpful to know about these things, and even just to sort of undo or peel back any cultural or social conditioning. So check it out. Thank you so much for joining me, Lenice. I had such a good conversation with you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being part of the Happy Rebel podcast community. Stay connected with us on Instagram at Happy Rebel. If you've enjoyed our episodes, please consider rating, liking, and reviewing the podcast. It truly does help us grow. Until next time, this is Kelly Street. Remember, embrace the dark and the light.